So before anything, I just kind of want to say that this is like essentially a yap session from me. Sorry guys. But I don't know. I feel like both of these topics just intertwine in a way that I can't exactly describe without diving into both of these a little bit and sort of jumping from topic to topic. So if I do tend to like tangent a lot on this one, I apologize. I think there's a lot of things that have started the resurgence of 2020 in the sense that people want to bring it back, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a mix of nostalgia, expression and lack of it in current media, and a bunch of different things, and I think it's generally a really, really good thing. I'm very happy to see it back, but it doesn't really feel the same, if that makes sense. I don't think it would ever feel entirely one-on-one with how it was in 2020, but that was definitely a time, and depending on who you ask, it was a really fun time. But I think the ideas and like the core of 2020 and the general, not just even like ArtTok, but TikTok's general space was more accepting and more ready to, I think, embrace things that were less stereotypical, and there was a lot more room for exploration in that sense, where people were sort of indulging more in alternative fashion, alternative makeup, and a bunch of different types of stuff, even just regarding like gender and sexuality also. I think after 2020 and things started to pick back up again and people started to, go outside, a lot of that ended up being buried, and I think that reflects a lot in the differences between TikTok and, by extension, ArtTok now in comparison to 2020. I think in that vein, ArtTok's current biggest issue is they're kind of afraid of, being too similar to each other. And while I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and I need to explain how this correlates to 2020, in 2020, I think there was a lot of mixing of art styles. So a lot of what people would consider a 2020 art style tends to have features that were integrated into a lot of other people's art styles at the time. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that, just generally, because I think I see a lot more of people bashing art styles for being similar nowadays than I ever did in 2020, for example, because alternative art styles during that time overlapped a lot, as I said earlier, and that was just the general norm. And I think a lot of people are pushing back against that, even though I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think one of the most recent examples is like people bashing, the moe art style, or just in past years, the jelly art style. I don't think there's anything wrong with like wanting artists to have, unique art styles. And there are definitely thousands of unique art styles for anyone. But there isn't a problem with art styles being similar either. I don't know. I feel like every other ArtTok post as of late has just been people talking about how there's similar things with tweening, similar things with art style, similar things with artist character designs, and thinking that's an inherent bad thing. I don't really know how to describe it. I think a lot of people are just afraid of seeming similar to other artists, and then of course bashing other artists who happen to have, similar things art-wise. And it's frustrating and it's sad, because I think one of the really cool things about art and expression and everything is the way that we take other things from other artists that we like and then kind of ingrain it into art style. Because for me, art styles that I had over the years were really reflective of the time. I think if you look at my like 2020 to 2021 art style, it does kind of show where it was time period wise and what inspirations I drew. So, they're a little bit afraid of similarity in that sense. But I also feel there's a lot of fear in the opposite way of having an art style that's too unconventionally attractive to the average person. And I notice this a lot with people who have art styles that are specifically like meant to emphasize certain features or be exaggerated in any way, shape, or form. They tend to get a lot of flack. So there's also that, and juggling at the same time having a similar art style to other people, because that also gets you a lot of flack. So in general, there's just a lot more judgment coming from all directions on ArtTok, where it feels like I'm seeing more discourse than, positive things being spread around ArtTok. And that's generally. I do think that some parts of ArtTok are really great, and I've talked about this before, but that was like one of the platforms that I really started to expand on, and it's a bummer that I'm not going to have that as an option anymore. But, so ArtTok is very complicated by all means, and I'm sure it was even in 2020, but as a beginner artist at that time, and just an artist as a whole during 2020, there was a lot more acceptance and a lot less criticism, I think, in general. The reason for people bringing back 2020 and all this 2020 nostalgia kind of creeping back in is there's one big thing that I think a lot of people miss from that time. And I was discussing this with a friend a little bit, but they said something that I thought was so true. And I think I'll link them in the description, but a lot of people miss 2020 because they miss being cringe. And I mean that like unapologetically, because 2020 was kind of a time when everyone was kind of exploring and trying new things, so there wasn't really much room for judgment because you yourself was not any better in that sense. It was kind of just everyone kind of going around doing separate things in a way that was kind of uplifting. And I think that also reflects, not just the expression of clothing, makeup, fashion of the time, but also in art itself, because a lot of people had similar alternative art styles that kind of mirrored each other, and there were specific things, like, I can't even describe it, the specific eyes, ears. There was just a lot of things that overlapped because a lot of people were, I think, borrowing from each other and kind of mixing that into their own style, and in turn kind of bringing it all together. Even just like generally, there's so many different discourses on ArtTok now that just feel so abysmal and stupid, for lack of a better word, because it's just not an issue. As I've said before with art styles, people are starting to dislike tweening again, even though I was literally talking about in another video a couple months ago how people have come to sort of like tweening a lot more than they did during animation memes times, where they thought, frame by frame was superior. Whole different story. Anyway, there's people getting a lot of flack for doing tweening animation instead of, frame by frame. And most recently, and this was the one that kind of got me, I was like, why are we arguing about this? But there were so many posts where people were kind of like getting upset at similar OC tropes being found in different people's OCs, and by that I mean people were upset about OCs kind of having similar backstories or similar themes, I think most commonly it was mentioning things like lab OCs, Mary Sue OCs, and, God OCs, whatever, right? It was just kind of perplexing because, it's really not an issue, and, as I've said before, overlapping and common themes are not a problem, and I think it's just a byproduct of people sort of collaging a bunch of different things that they like into one thing, and that's really cool. But apparently it isn't to some people on ArtTok. And I think all of these things have in common, just like people have that fear of being cringe or being perceived as cringe. And it's so ironic because I feel like ArtTok, the art community, digital art as an online thing as a whole, is kind of built on being cringe. I don't really have the words for it because I can't really use any word besides cringe, but it's more or less like unapologetic expression of oneself. And that's one of the things that was really cool about art, and one of the things I really loved about doing art and publicly posting it. I don't think it'll ever be, as non-judgmental and welcoming as it was in 2020 or 2021. And I think that's a bummer. Even just seeing the resurgence kind of happen again, I'm like, I don't know. They just kind of have that issue on ArtTok, essentially. And this isn't just like limited to ArtTok in some themes. I think it's also a general thing where people are afraid of being expressive. But, But in general, I do think it's a bummer that TikTok as a whole and as a platform is sort of taking a tumble, and the fate of TikTok itself becoming uncertain in that sense. Because again, that was one of the platforms that I started to build myself up on, and now that I've branched over here, this is probably where I'm gonna be most active, but that was, the place I really was building a lot of stuff on. And I have really wonderful mutuals on there, and there's a lot of really great things about ArtTok, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I just think it's a bummer. And yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on all of this. This was really just a ramble by all means. I don't have the words. But yeah,